Good morning, everyone. This week is the first week of our online learning class for the Enrolled with Credit option. So those of you who are choosing this option, every week I'll upload a lesson and you will also have some assignments to do. And so this week's topic, our lesson is going to be on brain development of infants and intellectual development of infants. And they go hand in hand. The brain develops and intellectual development happens at the same time. So, newborns learn about the world through their senses. So everything they see, hear, smell, taste, and touch, that is how they are going to have their brain develop through all of those senses. So our information from our senses is sent through our nerves to our brain. And our brain receives these messages and it takes it into account and it makes things that we call connections, and we're going to talk about those in a little bit. And the more we get connections from our brain, the more our brain learns, and then our brain can start telling us what to do. It can send messages once those connections get strong enough. So if our brain keeps learning that our mom is giving us milk through a bottle, and we're giving us milk through a bottle, and our mom is holding it, soon our brain's going to tell our body to put our hands on that bottle, and our hands will try and feed ourselves. And it takes a while, but those connections, as they're made and as they get stronger, our brain learns one thing, and then our brain can tell our body to do it once the connection gets strong enough. And so through learning through our senses, if a baby hears their mom's heartbeat, they start to recognize that's her heartbeat. They start and hear that sound and recognize that sound, and their brain can understand their mom's heartbeat from their dad's heartbeat. And they can feel the difference between the clothes that they're wearing or the blankets that they're touching. As they get older, they can understand that one might feel softer and one might feel fuzzy, and they won't understand those feelings, but they can differentiate that they're different. And so that just starts to make connections in their brain, understanding the different feelings. Same as they normally taste milk, and then once they start to teeth, they put a lot of different things in their mouth, like fingers and toys, and so they're going to start understanding the difference between those tastes. So all of those experiences with our senses are what are creating our brain development. And so our brain, it's divided into different sections. And depending what class you take, there's always lots of different certain parts of the brain that they want you to know. And there's lots of different parts that people think are important to know. But for the basis of this lesson, we're just going to talk about these 6. And each of these controls a specific function of the body. So we have the cerebrum, the thalamus, the pituitary gland, the brainstem, the spinal cord, and the cerebellum. And so those are the 6 parts that we are talking about. So the cerebrum, which is this whole top part right here, it is the home of the cortex or the cerebral cortex. So this is the frontal cortex. It's where all our executive functioning skills happen. So our time management skills, our short-term memory, all of the skills necessary to be a human is in our frontal lobe, and that doesn't develop until you're 25 for females and a little bit later for males. They're usually a year or 2 after females. And this whole part of the brain promotes more complex learning. It's where all our language development and our movement and all of that stuff happens. And it receives information from the senses and it directs motor activities. And motor activities can be body movement or it can be speech, memory, problem solving, those kind of things. So remember, the important thing is that our senses, so our sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch, it's creating all of our development. So then we have the thalamus, and the thalamus is right here in the middle. It connects the spinal cord to the cerebrum, and it is the place that controls the expression of emotion. So all of our emotions are controlled in our thalamus. Then we have the pituitary gland. It's down here. And the pituitary gland secretes hormones that regulate growth, metabolism, and sexual development. Then we have the brainstem over here, And it controls involuntary activities such as breathing, heart rate, and blood pressure. It is always doing things on its own, and that's functioning, obviously, since we're born. And then we have the spinal cord, and it is what is connecting our brain to our body and our body to our brain. The brain's going to send messages to our body, and it's going to come through the spinal cord. And our body is going to send our messages to our brain, and it's coming through the spinal cord. It's our road in our body. And then we have the cerebellum, and it controls muscular coordination and balance, and it's right here. So those are the 6 parts that we're going to worry about for this class. So then within the brain, we have our neurons. And when you're born, you have all the neurons that you need in your life. The neurons are going to develop, and they're going to make connections that are going to get stronger, but you won't ever get any new neurons. And there's billions of nerve cells when you're born. And neurons make a lot of changes. They sprout these little arms that are called dendrites. And these dendrites are where we make all of our connections. So they keep sprouting and sprouting and sprouting. And the more dendrites that you have, then the more connections you have. And then there's also the axons. And the axons are what connect the dendrites, and in the axons, they connect to the neuron. And then the tiny little gaps in between, those are called synapses. And the synapses are where the messages are sent from. And so if we move to the next slide, we're going to talk more about that. So synapses, they send the messages from one neuron to another because we have these tiny little gaps, and the dendrite doesn't touch the neuron, and they just get the information from a chemical called neurotransmitters, and they send the information in that tiny little gap of the synapse. And axons, they are what make everything happen quicker. So the more axons and the more dendrites that you have, then the more quickly things will happen. The more quickly those connections will be made, and the more our brain will develop. So the next important thing is the melanin coating. And so if you look here on the picture, we have our long axon, and you can see the melanin coating on it. And so what this is it makes it easier to transmit signals. So it speeds up our development. It speeds up those connections that we're making. The axons that control motor activities like vision and hearing, they're going to get the melanin coating first. Because when you're born, the 2 things you can do is you can see and you can hear. And that's all of the focus when you're a newborn baby. And so those are going to develop first so that you can get strong connections with your vision and your hearing. Then it's going to move on to other things like touch and other senses like taste. And those are going to develop, and those are going to get coatings. And as you grow old, and if you don't have the melanin coating on your axons, it's going to be harder for you to learn things. And so if a kid has difficulty with learning and learning new tasks, then it might be because they don't have enough melanin on their axons. So the arms that grow on the neurons, the more links that develop, then the more paths the brain has. So the more arms, the more links, the more paths. So we're always having those connections growing because more and more and more of these links and arms and paths are growing. So think of more paths means more brain power, because the more paths you have, the quicker a connection is made. The more times that a baby picks up a cup, the better it's going to get at it. In the beginning, if they start picking up a cup, it might be hard. They might drop it. They might not hold it securely or properly. They might need help from a parent. But soon, after they keep doing it, and their brain understands that reflex and that movement that they have to make, the connection will be stronger, and they will be doing it subconsciously. The brain will start telling the body to pick up the cup instead of the baby picking up the cup to teach the brain. And so think of it like a city. The more roads we have, the more places there are to go. And the quicker you can go places, because not everyone's on one road. There's lots of different ways you can get there. So your brain's the same. The more connections you have, the quicker it is. And that's the important thing. As babies are developing, especially in their first 2 years, all of these connections are being made. And so all of these paths are taking place that are going to be in place for the rest of their life. And so this is where it's really important, like I was just saying. You're born with only the neurons that you'll ever have, but what makes that remarkable is that all of these dendrites and axons, they form, and you have all these connections forming. And by 2, your brain is full of connections. And actually, you lose connections as you get older. This is as developed as your brain will probably ever be, because all of our development happens in our first couple years. Everything that we see, hear, smell, taste, and touch is creating a connection and creating our experience and creating the development that happens in our brain. And because of that, this development impacts the rest of your life. So if you make these connections as a young child and they're negative connections because there was neglect or there was trauma in the household, that neglect and trauma is going to carry on to when you're older and you're still going to have that neglect and trauma. And so how we treat infants and toddlers is extremely important for their development. It's going to be how their brain functions for the rest of their life. And now those things can be changed, like we're going to talk about in a little bit, but it is not easy. The connections that you make as a baby is so important, and that's why it's important to make sure that those are positive ones, so that the kid has the most successful chance of having these positive connections in place for their life. So the more you perform a task, the stronger that connection comes. Like I said before, drinking from a cup. In the beginning, it's going to be flimsy, but soon you're going to be able to do it by yourself. Same as anything. When you learn to ride a bike, in the beginning, it's hard, but soon it becomes subconscious, and it's never going to be something that you lose, because if you keep it up, you'll always have it. And that's important about things that can be lost. So there's this process, and it's called pruning. And essentially what that means is that use it or lose it. Your brain is always learning new things, especially as you get older and you're in school and you're learning new skills and you're learning new things in school. You're going to be always adding new connections. And so your brain gets rid of old connections that it no longer needs. So if you're not using it, it loses it to make room for the new connections that you're having. So it's not permanent. So if you learned French when you were 5, if you don't use it, you might not have it when you're 7, because you're learning new connections and you have new things that you need to make room for. So every brain is organized in a unique way. And this is really important because experiences shape how our brain is organized. So everyone's senses, like we've been talking about, their sight, their hearing, their smell, their taste, their touch, that's what is creating the way that their brain develops. So no one has the exact same experience, not even siblings, because you can perceive things different ways, because perception is key. So everyone's brain is different. And most brain development happens in the first years of life. Like we've seen in that picture back here, all of this development in the first 2 years. And because of that, we have experiences that are affecting our development, and they're affecting our lives, as we move forward. And so if you learn negative things as a baby and you have negative experiences, then you're going to continue those negative patterns as you get older. If you don't learn how to soothe yourself properly, or you weren't soothed in a positive way as a baby, then as you get older, you're not going to be able to self-soothe yourself. If you can't self-soothe yourself from a tantrum when you're a toddler, then you can't self-soothe yourself whenever you're older, and it's going to be hard to learn how to do that. It takes a lot of work to change the connections that we've made. If you were neglected as a child and weren't shown a lot of love and compassion, you're not going to be able to show love and compassion until you learn how. And it takes a lot of work to make those connections, because our brain has made the connection that we don't show love and affection, and that's how it is. And in order to make your brain understand that you can show love and affection in a positive way, you have to work on it. And so when you learn those techniques and those strategies later in life, that's why it's really hard to change. And that's why it's really hard for people to change, because those connections that we have in our brain were developed when we were a child, when we were an infant. All of those connections. And they've been in place. They were the groundwork for our brain developing. So it's really hard to change them. That's why it's so important to make sure that we have positive influences when kids are infants. And now here's a video that we're going to watch all about what we've said, just reviewing it.
Science tells us that the experiences we have in the first years of our lives actually affect the physical architecture of the developing brain. This means that brains aren't just born, they're also built over time based on our experiences. Just as a house needs a sturdy foundation to support the walls and roof, a brain needs a good base to support all future development. Positive interactions between young children and their caregivers literally build the architecture of the developing brain. Building a sturdy foundation in the earliest years provides a good base for a lifetime of good mental function and better overall health. So just how is a solid brain foundation built and maintained in a developing child? One way is through what brain experts call serve and return interactions. Imagine a tennis match between a caregiver and a child, but instead of hitting a ball back and forth across a net, various forms of communication pass between the two, from eye contact to touch, from singing to simple games like peekaboo. These interactions, repeated throughout a young person's developing years, are the bricks that build a healthy foundation for all future development. But another kind of childhood experience shapes brain development too, and that's stress. Good kinds of stress, like meeting new people or studying for a test, are healthy for development because they prepare kids to cope with future challenges. Another kind of stress, called toxic stress, is bad for brain development. If a child is exposed to serious ongoing hardships like abuse and neglect, and he has no other caregiver in his life to provide support, the basic structures of his developing brain may be damaged. Without a sturdy foundation to properly support future development, he is at risk for a lifetime of health problems, development issues, even addiction. It's possible to fix some of the damage of toxic stress later on, but it's easier, more effective, and less expensive to build solid brain architecture in the first place. One of the things building sturdy brain architecture supports is the development of basic emotional and social skills. An important group of skills, which scientists call executive function and self-regulation, can be thought of like air traffic control in the child's mental airspace. Think of a young child's brain as the control tower at a busy airport, all those planes landing and taking off, and all of the support systems on the ground simultaneously demand the controller's attention to avoid a crash. It's the same with a young child learning to pay attention, plan ahead, and remember and follow lots of rules. Like all of us, kids have to react to things happening in the world around them, while also dealing with worries, temptations, and obligations on their mind. As these demands for attention pile up, air traffic control helps a child regulate the flow of information, prioritize tasks, and above all, find ways to manage stress and avoid mental collisions along the way. Having this ability is a necessity for positive and level mental health. Developing effective air traffic control, overcoming toxic stress, and building solid brain architecture are things kids can't do on their own. And since strong societies are made up of healthy, contributing individuals, it's up to us as a community to make sure all young people have the kinds of nurturing experiences they need for positive development. To build better futures, we need to build better brains.
Okay, so one thing that's important for us to remember is that babies learn through their experiences, through their senses. So everything they see, hear, smell, taste, and touch is what is creating that brain development. And brain development creates their intellectual development. And so the following slides are going to outline the developmental skills that babies learn throughout their first year. And as their brain develops, these intellectual skills are forming. So for ages 1 to 2 months, the developmental changes that are happening is they're following moving objects with their eyes, they're gaining information through their senses, they prefer faces instead of objects, they cry to indicate their needs, and they can distinguish between familiar and unfamiliar voices. Then when they become 3 to 4 months, they can start and recognize their caregivers' faces. So that means they start and recognize their parents' faces, or if they have a nanny or someone who's around a lot, faces are being recognized. They can distinguish between these familiar and unfamiliar faces. They grasp at objects with touch now. So in the beginning, it's sight and hearing, and now we're getting into touching. And they try to swipe at objects, so they're getting more movement in. They're interested in their own hands and feet, so they're going to be exploring their own body a lot. Practice making sounds and respond when a caregiver talks. They really understand that person's voice and they're used to it. 5 to 6 months, they're alert for longer periods of time. So they're not napping as much. They could be up for 2 hours at a time. They reach for objects and grasp with their entire hand. And they might have better control when they're grasping for things now. Study objects carefully. They look at objects that are dropped. So if they drop an object when they're on their high chair, they might be looking on the floor to see where it is. They can play peekaboo, recognize their own name, distinguish between a friendly voice and an angry voice, and make sounds to indicate pleasure and displeasure. Then by months 7 to 8, they can imitate the actions of others. And babies and humans really learn by imitating. That's how we stand by social norms and how you make friends and how the basis of our relationships happen and our development is also through imitation. So they're starting that process and they begin to understand cause and effect. They remember things that have happened. We aren't going to remember what happened when we're 7 to 8 months, but babies will start to form memories, but we lose those as we get older. They can smile at themselves in mirrors, and you notice a lot of baby toys have mirrors on them because babies like to look at themselves, and they'll start to recognize themselves at 7 to 8 months. And they sort objects by size, so all of those nesting doll toys. They solve simple problems, recognize some words, so like eat or milk or those kind of words that the parents are like nap, the parents are using a lot, those kind of words. Babbling imitates inflections of speech, so they're going to be vocal at this point. They might start their cooing and their cawing and babbling a lot more. It's not going to be actual words yet, but they're getting there. They're getting close to their first words. And then 9 to 10 months, they search for hidden objects. They can handle medium-sized objects now skillfully. Before it would have been just small objects. They can take items out of containers and put them back in. They can play patty cake, respond to words. So they should be able to say words now. They might not be able to, but they might be. And they can obey simple commands and directions. So maybe they could sit up, or they can walk, or they can stand. They can manipulate objects skillfully. At 11 to 12 months, they like to look at picture books. They fit blocks in boxes inside one another. They know parts of their body, so when their parents are talking to them, they might know their nose or their arm or their leg or their toes. But when their parents say them, they might know what they mean. They can pick up small objects with their forefinger and their thumb, so that's starting to get into some fine motor stuff. So fine motor are like small movements and gross motor is big movements. Recognize many words, so they might understand more words. They can't speak it yet, but they're starting to learn those words, especially if the parents are talking to them. It's really, really important for babies to be spoken to. And not just like watching TV and stuff doesn't really matter, although people seem to think that it will give them some language development. It's not as effective as when an actual parent or caregiver speaks directly to the baby. Even though they can't understand it, it's so important for speech development for them to speak directly to the baby. And by 11 to 12 months, they should be able to speak some words regularly. So mom, dad, milk, yes, no, some basic words. And then, so play is essential for intellectual development for babies. So all baby toys are designed to help develop a skill. Babies learn skills quickly, so their toys change quickly. Just like we seen back here, all of these skills, this is going 2 months at a time. They're learning all these new things. That's a lot of development in 1 year. And so they're learning these skills so quickly, then their toys are going to change so quickly. And toys are created to help develop these skills. They're not just fun things. Play is so essential. So, birth to 3 months, babies are looking and listening. Remember, they're using those two senses. So, bright colors and interesting sounds are really important for their toys. Then we have 4 to 6 months, and we learn touch is an important sense now. So they want things that they can touch, they can handle, they can bang, they can shake, they can suck, they can chew. Because they're teething, everything's going in their mouth at this point, all of it. Toys should be small to handle, but because they're going in their mouth, they can't be too large, so they have to be too large so that they can't swallow. So you want them to be small enough they can hold it because they're still little and they're still not able to hold big things, but it can't be too small that they can swallow it. So then we have 7 to 9 months, and babies still want to touch and throw and pound and bang and shake and handle lots of different things, and they're always banging and shaking things. They're always exploring. And so anything that makes a noise fascinates them at this age. So that's important to think about when you're looking at your assignment this week. And then 10 to 12 months, babies need to crawl after things. They're crawling. Some of them are going to start walking soon, so it's something that they can chase. And those who are walking already might want toys that they can push or they can pull, or the little bouncy chairs that they walk around in. Those are great for right now. They're interested in toys that they can manipulate and toys that are going to promote those skills. And at 10 to 12 months, we're crawling and we're hopefully trying to promote some walking too. So that's all of the lesson. And this week's assignments, you're going to be reading an article titled Brain Development. It's in the post where I posted this lesson. And then in our assignments tabs, you have an intellectual development research assignment, which is going to focus on some of the things that we talked about in this lesson, as well as from the brain development article. And then you're going to be looking up a theorist named Jean Piaget on the internet, and there's some questions about his theory because he was one of the pioneers in intellectual development of babies and infants, and he goes all the way to school-age children. So for the next rest of this course, we're going to be talking about Jean Piaget as well as some other theorists when we're talking about the development of children. And then the last assignment is your infant toy assignment. And so you're going to have to look at the skills that we just talked about back here, and based on the skills that the babies are learning, you're going to create a list of toys that are good for the babies to use during those times and that will help learn those skills. And then you're also going to create your own toy that doesn't exist. What would it be and what skill would it focus on? You can choose. And so those are your assignments. And if you have any questions about anything, make sure you send me an email. I'm happy to help.